Okay, welcome back to part two of the synthesis lecture. When we last left off, we were talking about Gerhard Richter's body of work, and I was talking about how even going back to the 60s, been this sense of his body of work splitting into different sort of tracks. And some things that he does that are very much these kind of like process-based, kind of a studio practice kind of thing, like the painting directly on top of photographs, and then other things that are more abstractions, and then those abstractions led to these more kind of non-objective paintings, although they may in some ways more have come out of the process works in some ways. And then also these kind of photo-based works, which you can see kind of their antecedents in the 60s work there. And so these different ideas, different trains of thought have been moving along, but they've always been related to each other, and they influence each other, and they keep coming back towards influencing each other, which I think is really, for me, the most interesting part is not just the separate tracks, but the fact that although he often seems like he has not a lot of desire to force any kind of interconnection, any kind of synthesis, but that synthesis does seem to happen periodically. Here's a different story where an older artist, going back to the abstract expressions period. There's a story about Philip Guston, and here the synthesis is maybe a little less, not so much like a constant process in his studio practice, but more a really important event that happened in his practice. And to start the story, you have to think about it. A certain period towards the end of the 50s, Philip Guston was very admired by many painters and many critics. Many saw him as being like the true, most pure abstract expressionist, the artist who really emphasized the idea that painting was about making a mark. And unlike many of the other abstract expressionists, he made a mark with a brush, directly, just like the tradition of painting. So he was also in some ways seen as the most sober of abstract expressionists, the most pure in some ways, but also the most connected to the tradition of painting. Um, and but for anybody's body of work, you start to get bored. You start to try to explore new ideas, and for him, two things started to happen. One, in his paintings, he started to want to have shapes rather than just marks, have places where there were blocks of color rather than just fields overall. And and then the other thing that was happening was in his drawings, things were starting to get actually quite representational, and then started to become quite kind of political and cartoony, and got to a point where he wasn't really showing his drawings to people other than his close friends. And especially the drawings, but also what was going on with the paintings, the drawings were almost like this body of work that was developing, and he had to at some point decide whether he wanted those things to influence. And as kind of a radical break, he started to bring these kind of ideas that were developing in the earlier drawings into his paintings. So where synthesis actually happened, and it was highly criticized. Many people were very upset about this change in his work, but I think the end result is amazing and fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about this synthesis in terms of designers. I have a couple of points I want to make about this. First of all, I want to say um, designers and their relationship to synthesis is a little bit different from studio people, in that studio people almost always know exactly, as we're talking about this, that how it applies to them is, am I going to have a body of work for my senior show, right? Is all of the stuff I'm doing leading towards me having kind of a coherent aesthetic, a coherent sense of a body of work? That's what this lecture means to them. For the graphic design students, it doesn't necessarily mean that. One of the points I want to make is that, in a way, graphic designers experience synthesis with every project. Like every project you do, every design project, because of you're looking at a lot of different research, you're doing a lot of thumbnails, and then you're pulling it all together, you're evaluating. So you're finding synthesis in that process right there. Also, for us in the department, I think another really important thing is that we want if designers don't find any other kind of synthesis, that they should at least find a synthesis in their design education. That when, as they become juniors and seniors and they look back at their experience in Design 1 and in typography and in Graphic Design 2 and History of Graphic Design, that they see these as not as separate learning events where I learned this here and I learned that, but as a part of a process that's transforming them from being an art student to being a designer, where we're training them to really think like designers. Um, and But synthesis can happen in other ways, such as we certainly do see um, some graphic design students who kind of develop an idea of kind of sort of a thesis body of work, something related to ideas that interest them and something that's a strong, interesting idea in graphic design that they want to pursue, and that faculty want to help them pursue it. And that's a really great thing to happen, right? Like generally in a senior show, the most important thing is that a graphic designer represents their portfolio well. But if they also represent something else that they're doing, I think that is fantastic. And then lastly, I think that, and this is not true about every designer, but we can certainly see in the full career of some designers, we can see a real sense of synthesis of where over time they really have pulled together all the things that, all the influences and all the things that made them good designers. And as they come together, that's the thing that makes them great designers. But that's not necessarily true about every designer. But it is certainly true about Stefan Sagmeister, who is very much a, but I would say he's very much a graphic designer who approaches graphic design with a very kind of studio ethic and a studio aesthetic. Um, and for various reasons. For one, because he believes strongly in the idea of making art and designers making things, making art, making projects that may not have a reason for being, may not have a client. So one of the things they do in their studio sometimes is they give themselves assignments, things they want to pursue, things they want to explore and communicate. This is a really interesting piece. It's made entirely out of pennies. It's an installation right in this park space. There's a person on a bicycle, and so that whole design is just made entirely out of pennies on the ground. And one of the things they do in his studio is that they will periodically take a year off. He will give a full sabbatical to everyone working in his studio. And part of this is the idea that he wants everyone who's worked for him to be fresh um, and to be creative and excited about being creative. But another thing they do is they'll give themselves these projects like the Happy Film or the Happiness Project, which eventually turned out to be a full gallery or museum installation where they made this full installation in one, I think in the Philadelphia Art Museum that we're seeing these images. It was multiple floors in a museum, all designed by them, and all to kind of explore the idea of what makes a person happy and how do you know you're happy. And it's very much using their graphic design training and the graphic design thinking, but also bringing it together so it is a synthesis of graphic design with studio art and with installation art. Okay, that is the end of this lecture. The next time we'll be talking about process.